Hey guys, tonight we step into a world where torchlight flickers against stone walls. The air smells faintly of smoke and wet wool, and the distant clatter of hooves echoes through narrow cobbled streets. You probably won't survive this, not because anyone's chasing you with a battle axe, but because what you think you know about the Middle Ages is about to be thoroughly demolished. You trudge down a hallway lined with suits of armor that gleam just enough to make you wonder why nobody polished them with modern WD-40. As you peer into shadowy corners, you realize the medieval world isn't exactly the grim, stagnant pit of despair everyone likes to imagine, though admittedly, some corners are grim indeed. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and the local time while you're at it. It makes this global castle tour feel surprisingly cozy. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You notice right away that the popular image of the Middle Ages, people living in mud huts, starving while knights clank around in shining armor, is a bit of a caricature. In reality, the medieval period spanned roughly 1,000 years, from the fall of Rome around 436 CE to the dawn of the Renaissance in the 14th or 15th century, depending on which historian you ask. That's a lot of time for humans to do a lot of things, from building cathedrals that seem to defy gravity to inventing rudimentary spectacles that make you squint and nod in appreciation. Historians still argue whether certain events really mark the beginning of the Middle Ages, or if it's just a convenient label invented later by Renaissance scholars eager to make themselves look smarter. Either way, you already sense that sweeping generalizations are going to fail spectacularly here. You shuffle through the imagined grime of a medieval street market. Merchants hawk woolen cloth and garlic, and you can almost smell the combination of roasting meat and livestock manure. You probably learned in school that everyone bathed once a year, on May Day if they were lucky, but that's not quite true. People did bathe, sometimes more frequently than you might guess, although scented soaps weren't exactly lush-level luxury. And yes, some odd practices existed. Wealthy folks occasionally used crocodile dung paste as a type of sunscreen or anti-itch treatment, which you realize sounds less like skincare and more like a dare. You raise an eyebrow, but historians still argue whether these remedies were actually widespread or exaggerated in later accounts meant to entertain or horrify. Stepping further, you notice that castles weren't just giant fortresses meant to crush peasants under stone walls. Many served as administrative centers, homes, and even marketplaces, humming with daily life rather than solely staging epic battles. The typical knight wasn't constantly jousting in full-plate armor either. Training, travel, and taxes consumed much of their time. And while movies have convinced you that everyone ran around with chainmail clanking every step, in reality, armor was expensive and heavy, reserved for the elite, and often customized for comfort. You chuckle at the thought of knights trying to sip ale without tipping backward, a practical challenge no Hollywood stunt could perfectly capture. You notice something else. The Middle Ages were full of contradictions. Universities sprouted in places like Bologna and Paris, while plague and famine struck nearby villages. Markets sold exotic spices, while local peasants eked out barely enough to survive. And yes, superstition thrived, but curiosity never went away entirely. Alchemists tinkered with metals and potions, monks copied texts with meticulous care, and everyday people found ingenious ways to make their lives both more comfortable and occasionally absurdly complicated. Historians still argue whether medieval society was generally progressive for its time or stubbornly traditional, but you can feel the pulse of a world more nuanced than any Dark Ages label would suggest. You pause at the edge of a wooden bridge over a muddy river, imagining yourself navigating this strange landscape of fact and myth. You're standing at the threshold of a journey through centuries, armed only with your wits, an open mind, and perhaps a pillow to rest your head on when the night gets long. The Middle Ages, you realize, are like a giant, intricate tapestry. Some threads are glittering gold, some are muddied with grime, and some are just plain weird. You're about to follow each thread, uncovering truths, oddities, and misconceptions that stubbornly survive in modern imagination. By the time you're done, you'll never quite look at a knight, a castle, or a medieval manuscript the same way again. And with that, you feel the first hints of adventure tickle the edges of your awareness. The floorboards creak, the lanterns sway, and you sense that history is whispering secrets just beyond reach, waiting for you to lean in close and listen. You take a deep breath of the imagined air, a mixture of smoke, stone, and distant markets, and step forward, knowing that this journey will bend every preconceived notion you've held about the medieval world. This is the moment where myths begin to crumble, and the truth, stranger, funnier, and far more human than you expected, begins to take shape. You step into a clearing under a sky smeared with pink and violet, and immediately someone, or maybe just your imagination, tells you that medieval people believed the earth was flat. You probably learned that in a cartoon, complete with people teetering on the edge of a literal cliff. But as you trudge through this mental landscape, you notice that the story isn't quite right. By the High Middle Ages, scholars across Europe, from Thomas Aquinas to educated monks in monasteries, knew the earth was round. They debated the size, sure, and how far it extended beyond the horizon, but flatness was not on the syllabus. Historians still argue whether the flat earth idea became popular later as a way to make the Middle Ages look foolish, and you have to admit it works almost too well. You wander closer to a medieval port on your mental map, where ships rock gently against creaking piers. Sailors charted courses with surprisingly advanced understanding of celestial navigation. The round earth wasn't just an abstract concept. It influenced how far they dared to sail and how maps were drawn, though these maps often look comically distorted to your modern eyes. And yes, some fringe sources claim that certain isolated villages clung to flat earth notions well into the 14th century, but it's hard to know how seriously to take these accounts. After all, gossip travels faster than science, even back then. You imagine a villager pointing at a globe for the first time and gasping, "So the world isn't a pancake?" And you can't help smiling. Turning a corner, you find a stack of medieval manuscripts, the pages curling like tiny waves. You pick one up gingerly, noticing marginal drawings, tiny humans riding on clouds, dragons perched on mountains, and occasionally someone scribbling what looks suspiciously like a flat earth diagram, but closer inspection reveals it's symbolic, a kind of metaphor for spiritual journeys rather than literal geography. You laugh softly. It's a relief to realize that not every bizarre illustration is a serious claim about the cosmos. Scholars still argue whether some maps, like the TO maps, were pedagogical or symbolic, which is another reminder that context matters. A map wasn't necessarily wrong in its time. It simply conveyed meaning differently than your Google Maps app. You continue down a winding mental path lined with tiny toy-like castles and model ships bobbing on a painted ocean. You stumble over a curious footnote in history. Medieval thinkers sometimes calculated the circumference of the earth with remarkable precision, far surpassing some of the early explorers who came later. Eratosthenes' methods from antiquity, taught through scholastic education, reached curious minds, meaning some medieval students could have whispered numbers that would make modern geography teachers proud. Yet when the story reaches today, pop culture collapses nuance into the flat earth myth, giving you a sneaky thrill. You're seeing the truth that most of your high school textbooks skipped. Then comes the quirky side of navigation. Medieval sailors sometimes carried objects like lodestones or magnets to guide their journeys, and some fringe accounts claim attempts at compass-like tools were enchanted. You imagine a ship's captain consulting a glowing rock, muttering instructions to the wind, and for a moment it feels like a fantasy novel, but historians still argue whether these objects were genuinely navigational or simply talismans. Either way, it adds flavor to the notion that medieval people weren't just bumbling peasants staring at cliffs. They were experimenting, theorizing, and sometimes wildly improvising in ways that make you grin at their inventiveness. You hear the distant clamor of market chatter in this imaginary port, mixed with the salty tang of the sea. You picture a group of children pointing at a globe for the first time, spinning it like a toy, debating whether the distant continents were real or myth. And somewhere, a monk in his scriptorium annotates a manuscript, writing in tiny letters about the size of the earth, with sketches that look almost modern. You can almost hear the soft scratching of quills, and it's comforting. This meticulous recording, the curiosity, the stubborn desire to know. You realize the flat earth myth survives not because it was true, but because it's just so entertaining to imagine humans teetering on the brink of a pancake world. Finally, as you leave the port and sail toward rolling hills in your mind, you notice how these misconceptions stick in modern culture. Video games, movies, and memes all contribute to the notion that the Middle Ages were a time of cosmic ignorance. Yet the truth, rich, complex, and sometimes downright clever, hangs just out of reach, waiting for you to appreciate it. You step over a miniature model of the globe, feeling a mixture of amusement and awe, and it dawns on you. History is rarely simple, and the round earth was just the beginning of unraveling the stories you thought you knew. You tuck the flat earth myth into a corner of your mind like a forgotten toy, ready to be unpacked later as you trudge onward through centuries of surprises, oddities, and truths stranger than fiction. You wander into a sun-dappled meadow, feeling the crunch of straw underfoot, and immediately the story of feudal chains presses against your imagination. You were probably taught that peasants lived in unending misery, bound to the land, shivering in mud huts while knights roamed freely, swinging swords and tossing coins like confetti. But as you trudge among this imagined patchwork of fields and villages, you realize the truth is more nuanced, and frankly, occasionally surprising. Serfdom existed, yes, but not every peasant was shackled in the legal sense. Many rented plots, owed dues, or served in ways that allowed movement and negotiation. Historians still argue whether serfdom was a trap or a flexible social contract, and you can see why there's so much debate. Every village had its own rhythm, its own quirks, and its own loopholes. You notice a group of peasants hauling hay, and you step closer, observing their expressions. They pause for a moment to trade gossip, joke, and even play small games with sticks and stones, a side of medieval life often ignored in textbooks. The romanticized idea of constant toil without social or cultural life collapses as you watch them hum tunes, sometimes echoing songs that might have traveled along trade routes from faraway lands. It's charming, really, like seeing a secret life behind a painted curtain. And yet some fringe sources suggest that certain regions impose particularly harsh obligations, almost like a medieval subscription service for suffering, though historians still debate the prevalence of such extreme cases. You wander past a wooden fence and stumble upon the village blacksmith, a squat man hammering sparks into the air. You realize that peasants weren't just passive laborers. Many had skills, trades, and responsibilities that gave them leverage in daily life. Some even traveled seasonally to other villages or towns for work, and a few were literate enough to keep records, correspond, or participate in legal contracts. The image of an unthinking, hopeless peasantry falters here, replaced with one of ingenuity, resilience, and sometimes cheeky cleverness. You smile, imagining one of these workers slipping a humorous note into a landlord's ledger just to break monotony. Historians still argue whether such subtle rebellions were widespread or romanticized later. Then there's the curious world of manorial courts. You trudge inside a mental vision of a sunlit courtyard where disputes over land, animals, or debts are resolved. The very idea that peasants had zero legal recourse is false. They could on occasion appeal to the Lord's court, and sometimes decisions even favored the peasant over the landlord. You chuckle at the thought of medieval legal drama, pigs accused of trespassing, sheep mysteriously disappearing, and arguments over whether a roof tile counts as property damage. Some fringe stories suggest animals were literally tried in court, pigs, donkeys, even insects, but you can sense that the truth is often exaggerated. Historians still argue how widespread these animal trials truly were, and your mind wanders to the absurdity of imagining a pig in a judge's wig. The air shifts as you move past barns and wells, catching the scent of freshly churned earth and baked bread. You notice that peasants celebrated festivals with music, dancing, and shared meals, reinforcing community ties and providing breaks from the labor cycle. Seasonal fairs offered exotic goods, storytelling, and even rudimentary gambling, tiny glimpses of joy in a life often misrepresented as endless drudgery. And yes, some villages imposed harsh fines or obligations, but you can see why historians still argue whether these rules were oppressive structures or negotiated arrangements that balanced duties with survival. You wander further, imagining small clusters of houses, gardens, and animal pens. Peasants managed livestock, cultivated vegetables, and sometimes participated in local councils. Their lives were complex, structured by obligations, but not wholly defined by them. The picture of feudal chains begins to dissolve, replaced by a living, breathing society that juggled labor, law, family, and leisure. And as you pause to watch a child chase a goat, you realize that medieval peasants, contrary to popular imagination, were far from helpless. They were navigating a world of rules, relationships, and resourcefulness. A world where humor, cunning, and survival often intertwine. Finally, you step onto a small hill overlooking the village, feeling a breeze sweep across the fields. The sun casts long shadows over thatched roofs, and you sense the rhythm of daily life: work, play, prayer, negotiation, and occasional mischief. Peasants were not slaves in the cinematic sense, and the rigid chains of feudal myth give way to a more textured, human story. You tuck the mental image of these fields and faces into your mind like a treasured painting, ready to contrast it with the grim dark ages looming ahead. In this world, misery coexisted with resilience, humor, and cleverness, and you can almost hear the laughter carried by the wind. Proof that history is rarely as simple as the myths we inherit. You trudge past the village and into a dense forest, the sunlight dappled through branches that sway in a gentle wind. Somewhere in the distance, a ruined abbey crouches like a sleeping giant, its stones slick with moss and centuries of rain. This is where the Dark Ages reputation hangs heavy, a shadow you've probably carried from childhood textbooks and late-night documentaries. The term itself evokes images of endless despair, intellectual stagnation, violent chaos, and unrelenting suffering. But as you wander among the rubble and listen to the chirping of birds, you realize that the reality was far more nuanced, and historians still argue whether calling this period dark is fair or just a clever insult cooked up by Renaissance scholars with a flair for drama. You notice that the abbey's walls are carved with intricate designs, angels frozen mid-flight, vines curling around saints' faces. Even in supposed darkness, art flourished. Illuminated manuscripts glimmered with gold leaf, chronicling not only religious texts, but also practical guides, poetry, and scientific observations. You run your fingers along imagined pages, marveling at tiny letters so precise you'd swear a microscope was involved. In the midst of plagues, wars, and famine, monks, nuns, and scholars maintain libraries, laboratories, and workshops that hum with quiet productivity. The dark narrative starts to crumble under the weight of creativity and learning, quietly thriving in shadowed corners. You wander further into a market town, the dirt streets alive with chatter and clanging. Blacksmiths hammer, bakers knead, and street performers juggle flaming torches, drawing crowds with cheers and laughter. The myth of constant fear and despair seems almost absurd when confronted with these daily rhythms. Peasants and townsfolk had celebrations, festivals, and rituals that punctuated the monotony of labor. Fringe accounts even suggest impromptu battle games in some villages, where locals mimicked nights for fun, but historians still argue whether these were entertainment or serious martial practice disguised as festivity. The forest opens to a riverbank where you imagine a group of scholars debating by candlelight. They discuss the stars, planetary movements, and herbal remedies, creating early foundations for what would eventually become modern science. Your mental ear catches fragments of arguments. One monk insists on the alignment of Venus, another warns of heresy. It strikes you that intellectual life was alive and evolving, even if literacy was limited to a select few. The dark and dark ages, you realize, mostly refers to limited documentation surviving to modern times, not the actual vibrancy of thought and culture. Some fringe historians even argue that certain technological advances, like water mills or eyeglasses, were underappreciated gems of this period. You step into a mental scene of a festival night. Lanterns glow, music drifts through narrow alleys, and villagers dance, their laughter mixing with the distant tolling of a church bell. You smell roasted meat, honey cakes, and a faint tang of wood smoke, and for a moment you forget all those grim cliches of the period. Yet you also catch glimpses of harsh realities, occasional raids, outbreaks of disease, and strict social hierarchies. It's a world of contrasts, a delicate dance between joy and survival. You note how stories of doom often overshadow the ordinary, productive, and even whimsical aspects of life, feeding the enduring myth of unrelenting darkness. You climb the Abbey's collapsed tower, imagining yourself peering out over a patchwork landscape of farms, forests, and tiny settlements. From this height, the world seems expansive, alive, and not at all shrouded in gloom. Traders move along roads, rumors travel faster than soldiers, and children splash in streams, oblivious to the label Dark Ages. And yet you hear scholars in your mind muttering about political instability, regional conflicts, and famine, reminding you that darkness existed, but it was a mix of challenge and triumph, not a blanket of ignorance. Historians still argue whether the term dark should be applied at all, or whether it's a convenient narrative shortcut that overlooks the ingenuity and resilience of ordinary people. Finally, you step back from the tower, feeling the sun's warmth on your shoulders and the breeze carrying the sense of both earth and history. You notice that what survives in stories, movies, and textbooks often amplifies the gloom, while daily life, art, scholarship, and innovation quietly persist in the background. You tuck this realization into your mind like a precious talisman, ready to carry it into the next stage of your journey. The curious and sometimes comical world of medieval hygiene, where myths about stink, dirt, and bathing will challenge even your sense of smell and modern sensibilities. The Middle Ages, you see, are never simply dark. They're a patchwork of light, shadow, and the weirdly human in between. You step into a narrow alley lined with half-timbered houses, and immediately your nose rebels against the imagined sense of the medieval town. You were probably told that people didn't bathe for decades, wallowing in filth while rats roamed freely. But as you trudge past wooden doors and peek into a bubbling public bath, the story begins to shift. Many people did bathe, often weekly if not daily, especially in towns with running water or public facilities. Wealthier households had private tubs, and monks sometimes soaked in hot springs, enjoying a level of cleanliness that would make you question your preconceived notions. Historians still argue whether the general population bathed as frequently as the records suggest, but the notion of a universally stinking medieval world is clearly exaggerated. You pause to inspect a merchant carrying barrels of scented oils, herbs, and soaps. Surprisingly, medieval people were aware of odors and hygiene's social importance. Perfume gloves, vinegar rubs, and rosewater baths were common among the higher classes, though they could double as status symbols. Fringe accounts even claim that some guild members produced toilet waters with ingredients so bizarre that imagining them makes you giggle. Think vinegar, crushed flowers, and occasionally substances that modern chemists would hesitate to mix in a lab. You lean in closer, imagining the scent, and note that historians still argue about how much these concoctions actually improved hygiene versus simply masking odors. You wander past a tavern and hear laughter mingled with the clinking of mugs. Some sources claim that townsfolk practiced personal cleanliness rituals far more ritualized than your own modern morning routines. Face washing, hair combing, and even tooth cleaning with herbal powders were not unheard of, and you picture someone grinning at a friend with a minty stick between their teeth. Of course, some fringe tales include bathing in animal milk or using crushed insects as toothpaste, which is a little hard to reconcile with your mental image of a pleasant morning routine. Historians still argue whether these bizarre remedies were widespread or simply exaggerated for storytelling. Moving along a riverbank, you spot a laundry scene. Women and men scrubbing clothes while gossip and children dart around. Public washing areas doubled as social hubs, where ideas, news, and advice flowed as freely as the water. Bathing for adults wasn't a daily ritual for everyone, but it wasn't a once-a-decade ordeal either. You notice that fear of waterborne illnesses sometimes limited bathing, though not the imagination behind it. And yes, some fringe sources suggest that certain nobles avoided water entirely, fearing it would expose them to evil humors. But scholars still debate whether these fears were actual practice or humorous exaggeration. You stumble upon a curious alley where buckets of water hang alongside herbs and flowers. Locals sprinkle scented oils and vinegar over their hands to avoid infection, or at least to smell less like a barnyard. Medieval hygiene blends practicality with ritual, the lines often fuzzy. You imagine a child dipping a hand in scented water, giggling as the smell masks the muddy river they'd been playing in. And then there's the quirky side. Some accounts claim that crocodile dung was used as a sunscreen or anti-itch paste. It sounds ridiculous, and it is. Yet you realize humans have always improvised with what's available, blending superstition and necessity. Historians still argue how widely such bizarre remedies were actually used. Passing a small square, you notice the influence of hygiene on fashion. Long sleeves, layered tunics, and veils weren't just decorative. They helped repel insects, absorb sweat, and even reduce odors in crowded spaces. Fringe stories tell of extravagant perfumed gloves exchanged at markets as both social signal and cleanliness aid. You can almost see townsfolk wafting the fragrance and nodding approvingly at one another, as if saying, "I may toil in mud, but I still smell acceptable." It's a scene both practical and strangely charming, bridging the gap between necessity and cultural aesthetics. You walk down a cobbled street toward a public bathhouse where steam rises from a wooden structure. The air is heavy with warmth, water, and faint floral scents. Inside, you imagine a mix of people washing, chatting, and performing small acts of grooming. The myth of constant stench fades, replaced with a more textured reality. Hygiene was uneven, influenced by wealth, location, and social custom, but it was never absent. You tuck this understanding into your mental map, feeling a curious respect for the resourcefulness, rituals, and sometimes comical approaches medieval people took to stay clean, smelling tolerable, and occasionally impressively fragrant. Finally, you pause at a window, watching sunlight glint off polished metal, tiled roofs, and bubbling water troughs. Medieval hygiene, as it turns out, was messy, inventive, and sometimes hilariously strange. But it was never as utterly repulsive as legends insist. The myths linger because exaggeration sticks in your memory far better than nuance, and you chuckle softly at the thought that future generations might whisper about your toothpaste habits with similar amusement. You step back into the alley, ready to encounter the next layer of strangeness. The courtroom dramas where animals might have stood trial, reminding you that medieval life was as absurd as it was practical, and occasionally downright whimsical. You wander through a misty village square, the scent of damp straw mixing with roasted bread and the occasional whiff of livestock. Somewhere, a pig snorts, and your mind immediately recalls the wild claim. In medieval Europe, animals were literally put on trial. You probably chuckled at the image in school, picturing a courtroom full of snorting pigs, judgmental cats, and maybe a jury of squealing chickens. But as you trudge past wooden stalls and lean into the rumor, you realize there's a surprising kernel of truth. In some regions, particularly in France and Switzerland, animals were indeed prosecuted for crimes ranging from destroying crops to injuring humans. Historians still argue whether these trials were serious judicial events or symbolic performative acts, but either way, they reveal a legal culture that looks bizarre through modern eyes. You pause at a cobblestone courtyard where a small donkey is tethered to a post. Fringe sources suggest the animals had legal representation, often a lawyer appointed to plead on their behalf, which you find delightfully absurd. You imagine a nervous attorney shuffling papers while a pig stares blankly from the witness stand. Yet beyond the humor, these cases reflected a society deeply invested in accountability and ritual, where even non-human participants were woven into the moral and judicial fabric. Some scholars argue these trials were mostly about enforcing order and deterring misbehavior, rather than genuine belief that the animals could understand legal concepts. But the absurdity of it lingers. As you stroll past a market fountain, you notice children playing near the water, scattering mud with glee. In the distance, a rooster crows, and you wonder if it could have faced legal repercussions for waking the town too early. Fringe accounts claim that certain insects and pests were even cited in some cases, though it's unclear whether these were recorded as serious offenses or later embellishments. You chuckle at the thought. Medieval lawyers probably had the most unusual client list in history. Historians still argue how systematic these animal trials were, with evidence suggesting they were sporadic, localized, and sometimes ceremonial rather than universal. You turn down a narrow alley where the local Lord's Court convenes. The wooden bench creaks as the scribes record proceedings in meticulous script. You can almost hear the hum of villagers gossiping about the spectacle. a pig accused of eating rye, a cow blamed for trampling a garden. Sometimes the accused animals were executed, sometimes just humiliated, and occasionally the case was dismissed entirely. The trials weren't merely for entertainment, they were a way to reinforce social norms, convey moral lessons, and uphold property rights. Fringe sources suggest that peasants sometimes use these trials to poke fun at authority, subtly mocking the legal system, which historians still debate. You wander toward a sunlit patch where a group of villagers watches a small drama unfold. A sow is paraded before the local magistrate while a lawyer argues on its behalf. You notice that the spectacle had layers of ritual, symbolism, and even a kind of humor that would be difficult to replicate today. The community seemed to treat these events with a mix of seriousness and amusement, reflecting both legal pragmatism and cultural storytelling. You grin at the thought of villagers whispering behind their hands, "I hope the pig's lawyer is competent," which feels oddly relatable even across centuries. Passing a wooden cart, you see evidence of record keeping, tiny scrolls noting fines, verdicts, and occasionally the unusual charges brought against animals. You realize that medieval law had an elasticity modern systems can't easily capture, blending morality, property rights, and social performance. Some fringe scholars argue that these cases were more about spectacle than justice. Yet you can't help but admire the creativity of a society that treated even its four-legged, or sometimes six-legged inhabitants as legal actors. It's messy, it's whimsical, and it's distinctly human in its strange adherence to order. As you move past the fountain and into a grassy knoll, you catch a glimpse of a cat being interrogated for allegedly killing poultry. You imagine the silent judgment, the villagers' chuckles, and the magistrate scribbling notes with serious intent. Some fringe accounts suggest that animals were sometimes excommunicated, a bizarre overlap of religious and civil law, which leaves you shaking your head in disbelief and amusement. Historians still argue whether these practices were widespread or isolated curiosities, but their very existence challenges your assumption that medieval life was entirely rational by modern standards. Finally, as you leave the courtyard, you notice how this odd legal culture blends absurdity, ritual, and morality into a surprisingly coherent social logic. Animal trials were not mere jokes. They were part of a world where rules, responsibility, and symbolic acts intertwined in ways that seem almost alien to you. You tuck this image into your mental archive, smiling at the thought of a legal system where pigs, donkeys, and occasionally cats could face consequences for misbehavior, and where the line between justice and theater blurred delightfully. Ahead, dungeons and torture devices await, promising a darker, more intimidating, but equally myth-laden chapter of medieval life. You descend into a cool, shadowed dungeon where the air smells faintly of damp stone and old iron. Your mind automatically conjures images of racks, thumbscrews, and sinister chains clanking as prisoners scream in terror. But as you trudge through the dim corridors, you realize that the reality is far less cinematic. Many of these torture devices existed, yes, but historians still argue whether they were used routinely or more as threats, tools of intimidation, or symbols of authority. The infamous rack, for instance, appears in court records, but there's debate about how often it was actually employed and whether most alleged victims endured it fully or at all. It's less a horror movie set and more a complicated moral theater. You step over a puddle of imagined water dripping from the ceiling and notice an array of implements arrayed on a wooden table: iron hooks, shackles, spiked chairs. Some fringe sources suggest that inventors competed to create ever more elaborate contraptions, almost like a medieval version of a sadistic engineering contest. You shake your head, smiling at the absurdity, and remind yourself that some stories were certainly exaggerated to terrify future generations or to sell pamphlets. Scholars still debate how widespread actual use was versus symbolic display, and you feel a strange comfort in the ambiguity. Medieval life is simultaneously dark and inventive, macabre and human. Moving deeper, you notice that dungeons were often integrated into administrative centers or castles, not hidden torture chambers of legend. Guards or scribes and visitors moved in and out, and the presence of prisoners served practical purposes: coercion, intimidation, and occasionally punishment, rather than constant spectacle. Fringe accounts even suggest that some devices were training tools for officials, helping them practice handling recalcitrant suspects, though historians still argue whether these claims are credible. You can almost see a nervous guard awkwardly adjusting a pulley, hoping not to trip while keeping appearances intact. You pass through an archway into a small claustrophobic room, imagining a prisoner sitting quietly on a stone bench. The imagined terror of dungeons is punctuated by a reality of mundane life: waiting, negotiation, bribes, and even occasional leniency. Torture was not always instant or dramatic. It often relied on psychological fear. You grin at the idea that horror legends exaggerate the spectacle, ignoring that medieval authorities were also pragmatic, balancing brutality with efficiency. Historians still argue how much of the dramatic imagery was propaganda versus lived experience, which adds layers of complexity to your understanding. Turning a corner, you encounter chains hanging loosely from the ceiling. Fringe stories claim these were used daily to suspend prisoners like ornaments, but a closer look suggests they were more often preventative measures, deterring escape or marking someone as under custody. Some records describe temporary restraints during interrogation, not full-scale displays of suffering. You imagine the prisoners sighing, rolling their eyes, and occasionally laughing nervously, humanizing a space often depicted as relentlessly grim. The interplay of fear, authority, and practicality makes you reconsider the cinematic version of dungeon life entirely. Passing a table with old parchments, you notice meticulous records detailing crimes, sentences, and sometimes the equipment intended for punishment. The bureaucratic side of medieval justice is oddly comforting. Humans organizing, planning, and sometimes improvising in ways that seem familiar across centuries. Fringe accounts of elaborate, grotesque torture devices sometimes served as warnings in manuscripts or theatrical exaggerations for traveling storytellers. Historians still argue whether these depictions reflect real usage or cultural storytelling, leaving you marveling at the combination of fear, humor, and ingenuity in everyday life. Finally, you step out of the dungeon into a faintly sunlit courtyard, feeling the cold stones beneath your feet warm gradually under imagined sunlight. The shadow of chains, hooks, and grim tales lingers, but now you see them through a lens of practical reality mixed with legend. Medieval torture devices were as much symbols of power and negotiation tools as instruments of horror, and understanding that balance helps you appreciate the strange, sometimes absurd human dimension of justice in this period. You tuck these lessons into your mind, ready to approach the next scene: witches, wizards, and the smoky, superstitious villages where fear and fantasy often merge into the myths that still haunt popular imagination. You step into a village square where smoke curls lazily from chimneys, and the scent of herbs and roasted meats mingles with a faint, nervous tension. Everywhere you look, someone whispers about witches, wizards, and magical mischief. You probably picture frantic villagers dragging hooded figures to bonfires, but as you trudge through this smoky scene, you realize the truth is far more complicated. Not everyone accused of witchcraft was immediately executed. Many were shunned, fined, or placed under surveillance. Historians still argue whether the infamous witch hunts were more a product of centralized panic, local superstition, or simply opportunistic social control. You wander past a wooden well where children play, imagining a woman accused of cursing the harvest. Fringe sources suggest that some accused witches performed elaborate magical rituals with oddly specific props: stuffed birds, chalk circles, and powdered roots, which sound like a medieval craft project gone awry. You grin at the absurdity. In some towns, magical accusations might have had as much to do with gossip, rivalry, or personal vendettas as actual supernatural belief. Scholars still debate whether witchcraft charges were mostly moral panic, economic manipulation, or genuine fear of malevolent forces. But the answer seems to involve a little of everything. You notice the faint shimmer of talismans dangling from doorways, herbs tied in bunches, and lines of salt sprinkled to ward off evil. Medieval people, like their modern counterparts, sought to manage risk with charm and ritual. Some fringe accounts suggest that small, magical protections were considered as effective as law enforcement, from simple bells to elaborate concoctions. You can almost hear a villager muttering, "Better safe than hexed," which feels timelessly human. Historians still argue how much of the belief in magic influenced law versus personal superstition, highlighting the layered nature of medieval thought. Turning down a narrow street, you spot a local healer mixing herbs and chanting quietly. You remember that medicine and magic often overlapped, and in this village, nothing seemed strictly mundane. People used charms, amulets, and incantations alongside more practical remedies, from poultices to leeches. Fringe accounts even claim some villagers borrowed wands or small relics from churches to enhance healing, blurring the lines between the sacred and the arcane. Scholars still debate whether these practices were mostly symbolic, practical, or somewhere in between, leaving a sense of mystery in the air. You approach a smoky tavern where conversations blend fear and humor. Patrons recount tales of local witches, strange lights in the forest, or vanished livestock. Some genuinely believing, others clearly exaggerating. The mix of entertainment, rumor, and superstition shaped daily life. You imagine someone exchanging recipes for potions as casually as you'd swap cookie recipes today, and the juxtaposition is oddly charming. Fringe sources even suggest that certain accused witches gained social leverage by their reputation, creating a kind of dark celebrity. Historians still argue about whether fame or fear drove accusations more, and you can see both threads weaving through the village. As dusk falls, the air thickens with the smell of smoke and herbs, and you notice how the visual culture of witchcraft played a role. Pointed hats, broomsticks, and cursed items were likely exaggerated over time. You picture a child's eyes widening at the sight of a black cat and a crow perched nearby, imagining curses flying like cartoon lightning bolts. Some fringe depictions suggest these symbols had serious social consequences, marking certain households as suspect, though scholars still debate the extent of their impact. It's a delicate dance between belief, performance, and rumor, which leaves you smiling at the complexity of social life. Finally, you wander past the last cottages into an open field where moonlight catches the tips of grass and the outline of distant trees. You realize that the fear of witches and magic wasn't just about irrational terror. It reflected anxieties over control, disease, and misfortune in a world full of uncertainty. Some accused were tragic victims, others opportunistic manipulators, and a few possibly genuine practitioners of folk rituals. You tuck this image into your mind, knowing that the next journey, through knights, armor, and jousting tournaments, will show that the legendary chivalric world is equally riddled with myths and half-truths, waiting for you to unravel them. You step into a sunlit tournament field where banners snap in the wind, and the smell of sweat, leather, and roasted meat wafts from nearby stalls. Your mind immediately conjures images of knights in gleaming armor, charging blindly into battle while tossing heroic one-liners. But as you trudge across the soft grass, you realize that real medieval tournaments were far more practical and far less cinematic than Hollywood would have you believe. Knights didn't constantly clank in full plate. Armor was expensive, heavy, and often customized for mobility. Historians still argue how cumbersome armor really was versus the carefully choreographed portrayals in films, and the truth lies somewhere in between. Protective, yes, but surprisingly functional. You approach the stables where horses stamp and snort, imagining the mounts armored as heavily as their riders. Fringe accounts sometimes suggest that horses wore full plate covering, like walking tanks. But in reality, only the wealthiest could afford partial barding, and many horses were nimble rather than fully encased in metal. You smile at the thought of a jousting horse dodging a lance with a grin, almost as if aware it's part of a theatrical display. Scholars still debate how much of the knights in shining armor imagery reflects everyday reality versus idealized tales created by poets and chroniclers. Moving toward the lists, you see knights practicing lance drills, their helmets gleaming, crest bobbing, and tunics catching the sun. These tournaments were as much about social display, practice, and networking as about combat. Fringe accounts suggest staged jousts were choreographed for entertainment, with lances deliberately blunted, targets exaggerated, and some matches prearranged to avoid serious injury. Historians still argue whether most tournaments were serious competitions or elaborate spectacles, and you can feel the tension between performance and martial skill vibrating in the air. You wander past spectators lounging on grassy embankments, cheering and waving banners. Nobles and merchants alike attended, using tournaments to display wealth, forge alliances, and occasionally arrange marriages. You notice that pageantry often mattered more than actual prowess. Knights needed charisma, style, and a willingness to follow rules as much as brute strength. Fringe accounts even describe knights using comically oversized or impractical weapons to entertain the crowd, which makes you chuckle at the blend of humor and danger. Scholars still debate how much these performances shape the ideal of chivalry versus reflecting actual battlefield skill. As you step closer to the training grounds, you see young squires learning the art of horsemanship, swordplay, and etiquette. They spent years practicing, often without ever participating in high-stakes combat. Your mental image of constant duels and battlefield heroics softens, replaced by the slower, disciplined reality of preparation and ceremonial skill. Some fringe sources claim knights engaged in staged mock battles for practice that could last hours. But historians still argue how realistic these were compared to real combat, leaving room for interpretation. Passing through the archway of the main lists, you notice the smell of sweat mixing with metal and hay, the sound of hooves striking the dirt, and the occasional grunt of exertion. The field is alive with energy, blending athleticism, ritual, and performance in ways you hadn't considered. You watch a lance strike a shield with a satisfying clang, imagining how the crowd erupts, and realize that these tournaments were simultaneously dangerous, entertaining, and deeply symbolic, reinforcing social hierarchy, honor, and prestige. Fringe depictions exaggerate heroics, yet the spirit of competition and spectacle is unmistakably real. Finally, you step back to observe the entire scene from a nearby hill. The lists, tents, and banners form a kaleidoscope of color and motion. Knights, horses, spectators, and musicians all intertwine into a living tableau, challenging your assumptions about medieval combat and chivalric life. Armor was practical, tournaments were performative, and knights were as human as the peasants you met earlier, capable of both humor and folly. You tuck this image into your mental map, ready to move forward into the grim streets of plague and pestilence, where rats, fleas, and exaggerated tales await to test the myths you carry about disease, fear, and human ingenuity. You step into a narrow cobbled street where the air carries the faint tang of smoke, rotting vegetables, and something a little harder to name. Somewhere in your mind the screams of "the Black Death" echo, and you imagine rats scuttling across rooftops, fleas biting relentlessly, and a whole town succumbing overnight. But as you trudge through this imagined cityscape, you realize the reality is far more nuanced. The plague, of course, was devastating, wiping out large swathes of populations in Europe between the 14th and 17th centuries. But historians still argue about the exact role of rats, fleas, and bacteria in its spread. Some evidence suggests human behavior, trade routes, and environmental conditions were just as critical, leaving your mental picture part horror story, part epidemiology lecture. You notice a stack of crates outside a merchant's shop, each labeled with spices, dried herbs, and other exotic goods. Trade didn't stop during plague years, though it often slowed dramatically. Fringe accounts suggest that some merchants deliberately avoided heavily affected towns, leaving entire villages cut off, but others risked travel for profit, making you chuckle at the timeless human mix of greed and daring. Scholars still debate how quarantine measures, voluntary or enforced, actually influenced the spread of disease, hinting that medieval people were more pragmatic and occasionally cunning than movies suggest. Moving past a puddle reflecting the cloudy sky, you glimpse the behavior of townsfolk, some washing hands, others sprinkling vinegar or incense to purify the air, some running errands while nervously avoiding neighbors. Hygiene practices, folk remedies, and superstition all intertwined, and some fringe accounts claim that priests sprinkled holy water on streets to ward off the plague, blending ritual with precaution. Historians still argue whether these efforts had any measurable effect, but you can appreciate the creativity and determination to survive in a world without germ theory. You wander toward the city gate, where guards note travelers' symptoms, sometimes restricting movement. Travel restrictions were rudimentary, inconsistent, and often symbolic rather than fully effective. Fringe reports claim that towns employed plague dogs, guard dogs trained to chase away sick individuals, which you can't entirely believe, but it makes for a colorful mental image. Scholars still debate how communities balance fear, commerce, and social cohesion, highlighting that medieval responses to disease were complicated, adaptive, and sometimes absurdly creative. Passing a market, you notice the human cost of the epidemic: quiet shops, empty streets, and whispered conversations about missing neighbors. Yet life didn't stop entirely. Communities adapted, rationing food, hiring new laborers, and reorganizing agricultural schedules. Some fringe accounts suggest that survivors held small, clandestine festivals, celebrating life in defiance of death, which you imagine as a medieval mix of sorrow and rebellious joy. Historians still argue how widespread these acts of resilience were, but the idea that humans find moments of levity, even during catastrophe, resonates across centuries. You pause beside a river where water runs dark with rain and refuse. Stories exaggerate the presence of rats everywhere, but reality was more selective. Rats thrived in certain environments, yes, but not every street was overrun. Fleas were abundant, but their impact was part of a larger ecological chain, intersecting with human density and sanitation practices. Fringe accounts claim that some towns deliberately tried to exterminate rats using cats and traps, blending practicality with superstition. Scholars still debate the exact vectors of plague, leaving room for mental imaginings that are both horrifying and scientifically fascinating. Finally, you look up at the skyline of spired churches, timbered homes, and distant fields. The Black Death left scars, yes, but it also reshaped economies, labor practices, and social structures. People experimented with hygiene, quarantine, and creative remedies, and the mythic horror of rats and fleas, while partly true, obscures the resilience, adaptation, and resourcefulness of medieval populations. You tuck this layered understanding into your mental map, prepared to explore the equally strange world of medieval medicine, where bizarre cures, herbal potions, and curious rituals await to challenge every assumption about healing and science in the past. You step into a dimly lit apothecary, the air thick with the scent of herbs, dried flowers, and something pungent that makes you wrinkle your nose. Shelves are lined with jars of roots, powders, and oddly shaped bottles, some labeled in precise Latin, others in the looping scrawl of a medieval hand. You probably imagine medieval medicine as nothing but leeches, plagues, and general incompetence. But as you trudge past rows of strange ingredients, you realize that while some remedies were bizarre, others were surprisingly sophisticated. Historians still argue whether certain concoctions actually had medicinal effects, but the mix of ritual, observation, and experimentation is undeniable. You notice a small cauldron bubbling over a fire as a healer stirs a murky mixture of herbs, wine, and crushed minerals. Fringe accounts claim that some of these remedies included ingredients like powdered mummy, vulture brains, or crushed gems, which makes you pause, laugh, and reconsider your breakfast choices. Yet not every potion was macabre. Many herbal remedies, willow bark for pain, honey for wounds, and garlic for infections, demonstrated keen observational science. Scholars still debate the efficacy versus placebo effect of these treatments, but it's fascinating to see that medieval healers were experimenting within their understanding of biology, even if it looks strange to modern eyes. You wander past a small table where a scribe copies medical texts from Arabic and Greco-Roman sources. Knowledge transfer was crucial, and medieval physicians often built on centuries of accumulated learning, translating and adapting texts rather than inventing everything from scratch. Fringe accounts even suggest that some doctors consulted astrology charts to time treatments, blending cosmic observation with practical care. Historians still argue how seriously astrology influenced actual outcomes, but you can see that observation, theory, and ritual were tightly intertwined in medieval healing. You step into a courtyard where townspeople gather to watch a healer demonstrate a poultice. Some fringe reports claim that these demonstrations involve theatrical exaggerations to maintain authority or entertain onlookers, which makes you imagine a medieval TED Talk complete with dramatic flair. The curious blend of spectacle and science highlights a key truth. Medieval medicine was as much about community, psychology, and ritual as it was about biology. Scholars still debate how frequently these public demonstrations affected real treatment outcomes, leaving you both amused and impressed at the ingenuity. Moving along a cobbled street, you notice a small boy holding a vial, wide-eyed as the apothecary explains its purpose. Education and apprenticeship were central. Knowledge was transmitted orally, through observation and via hands-on practice. Fringe tales suggest some apprentices experimented with ingredients on themselves or unlucky neighbors, leading to comedic or disastrous results. Historians still argue how structured these apprenticeships were, but it's clear that practical learning and improvisation went hand in hand. Passing a sunlit archway, you spot a healer applying a leech to a patient's arm. You grimace but notice the methodical care. The leech was used for controlled bloodletting, and hygiene practices were often surprisingly attentive, such as cleaning wounds and boiling instruments. Fringe sources claim that leeches were applied en masse for dramatic effect, but historians still argue how common excessive bleeding actually was. The scene reminds you that medieval medicine walked a fine line between observation, superstition, and experimentation, often resulting in practices both harmful and beneficial. Finally, you wander to a quiet room where a physician consults a leather-bound manuscript, scribbling notes and occasionally checking a pulse. You realize that the image of medieval doctors as mere charlatans is unfair. They were observers, experimenters, and theorists navigating incomplete knowledge. The bizarre and the practical existed side by side. Poultices next to astrology charts, herbs next to powders of uncertain origin. Historians still argue whether certain treatments genuinely cured ailments or simply comforted patients. But the ingenuity, adaptability, and sometimes theatrical flair of medieval medicine are unmistakable. You tuck this insight into your mental map, ready to step into the whimsical world of dragons, giants, and other creatures that populated medieval imagination. You step into a shadowed forest where mist curls around twisted roots, and the air smells faintly of damp earth and pine. Somewhere nearby, a storyteller is murmuring about dragons, giants, and other fantastical beasts, and your mind immediately conjures flaming monsters and oversized trolls. You probably imagine medieval belief in monsters as a naive superstition, but as you trudge through this eerie landscape, you notice that many of these creatures had symbolic, allegorical, or cautionary roles. Historians still argue whether certain monster tales were believed literally or served as moral and political metaphors, and you realize the truth is as much about psychology as zoology. You pause beside a river where local villagers claim a water dragon lives beneath the surface. Fringe accounts suggest that fishermen sometimes proofed their tales with exaggerated fish or skeletal remains, which makes you smirk at the medieval mix of imagination and marketing. Yet these stories often served practical purposes, keeping children away from dangerous waters or explaining natural phenomena beyond contemporary understanding. Scholars still debate how much literal belief drove these tales versus social storytelling, highlighting the blend of risk, entertainment, and education. Moving along a winding path, you see an ancient oak with strange carvings. Some fringe sources claim the marks were made by giants or fairies, and you imagine a massive finger tracing the bark, a thought simultaneously charming and absurd. In reality, carvings often signal boundaries, recorded events, or indicated sacred sites, yet humans naturally preferred magical explanations for the inexplicable. Historians still argue about the line between folklore and superstition, but the way stories shape behavior is undeniable. Villagers may have avoided certain areas simply because they feared what lurked in legend, not because of real threats. You wander past a hillside where shepherds tell tales of flying serpents, unicorns, and monstrous wolves. Some fringe sources insist that these creatures were used as warnings to reinforce social norms or religious lessons. For example, dragons often symbolize greed, sin, or political enemies, giving moral texture to otherwise frightening stories. Scholars still debate the precise mix of literal belief and metaphor, but you notice how these fantastical accounts offered both entertainment and ethical guidance, functioning as a medieval version of the cautionary tale. Passing a moss-covered stone, you notice tiny footprints beside it, likely animal tracks, yet local children whisper about trolls and goblins. Fringe accounts suggest adults sometimes stage these signs to reinforce belief in supernatural beings or to scare troublemakers, which makes you chuckle at human creativity. Historians still argue how seriously most adults took these legends versus treating them as playful or didactic tools. And you sense that the boundaries between truth and story were intentionally fuzzy, allowing imagination to flourish. You come across a small chapel where paintings depict dragons battling knights, saints, and angels. These illustrations, you notice, were never purely decorative. They conveyed moral lessons, heroic ideals, and cosmic order. Fringe interpretations suggest that some medieval artists deliberately inserted absurdly large beasts to amuse or impress, leaving a playful wink hidden in plain sight. Scholars still argue whether these depictions were intended literally, allegorically, or both, revealing a culture comfortable with ambiguity, metaphor, and visual storytelling. Finally, you step into a moonlit clearing where fireflies blink like tiny stars. You feel the thrill of the imagination stretching centuries backward, understanding that dragons, giants, and other fantastical creatures were more than errors or naivety. They were storytelling, moral guidance, and wonder. The line between belief, metaphor, and exaggeration was blurred, yet it created a vivid, emotionally resonant world that survives in our myths, literature, and legends today. You tuck this magical understanding into your mind, ready to return to the earthier, slightly sillier world of medieval food, drink, and culinary myths, where exaggeration, improvisation, and human creativity reign supreme. You wander into a bustling medieval kitchen, the air thick with the aroma of roasting meat, baking bread, and a hint of something fermented that makes your nose twitch. You probably imagine medieval food as gruel, stale bread, and mystery meat. Yet as you trudge past simmering cauldrons and chopping boards, you notice the variety, ingenuity, and occasional absurdity of the cuisine. Historians still argue whether these extravagant dishes were common or largely confined to noble tables, but even peasants enjoyed seasonal vegetables, dairy products, and occasionally fresh meat. You pause at a wooden table stacked with pies, pastries, and fruits, some candied, some spiced with exotic imports. Fringe accounts suggest that wealthy cooks sometimes employed sugar, saffron, or gold leaf extravagantly, creating desserts that would make modern pastry chefs gasp. You imagine a noble biting into a pie filled with poultry, spices, and a hint of rosewater, thinking it normal while a servant sneaks a taste with wide-eyed delight. Scholars still debate how frequently spices and imported goods reached everyday tables, but the spectacle of flavor, presentation, and cultural exchange is undeniable. Moving past a barrel of ale, you notice cooks preparing a stew with ingredients both practical and bizarre: meats, grains, herbs, and sometimes dried flowers or unusual garnishes. Fringe sources claim that medieval cooks experimented with ingredients like crushed amber or powdered pearls for medicinal or aesthetic purposes, which makes you chuckle at the audacity. Historians still argue whether these practices were serious or symbolic, yet they reveal an adventurous, playful side of medieval gastronomy often hidden behind the gruel stereotype. You wander toward a hearth where bread bakes in clay ovens, its scent mingling with roasting meats. Peasants' diets were simpler, yes, but far from monotonous. Seasonal vegetables, legumes, and dairy products formed the backbone of meals, with occasional additions of eggs, poultry, or fish. Fringe accounts even suggest foraged feasts, where wild mushrooms, berries, and herbs were gathered for both sustenance and flavor. Scholars still debate how much of this diet was dictated by necessity versus tradition, showing that medieval food practices balanced practicality and pleasure in ways both familiar and alien. Passing a table of preserved foods, you notice pickled vegetables, salted meats, and dried fruits. Preservation techniques were surprisingly sophisticated, employing vinegar, smoke, and salt to extend shelf life. Fringe accounts claim that some noble kitchens used methods bordering on alchemy to create bizarrely preserved delicacies, from candied meats to spiced jellies, leaving you equal parts impressed and amused. Historians still argue how widespread such culinary innovations were, highlighting the interplay of necessity, experimentation, and showmanship in medieval cooking. You step into a corner where brewing takes place. Large barrels of beer, ale, and mead bubble gently, the aroma warm and slightly sweet. Common folk drank these beverages frequently, often in place of potentially contaminated water, which flips your modern assumptions about cleanliness. Fringe accounts even suggest that some tavern owners spiced or flavored brews with herbs, roots, or occasionally mildly hallucinogenic plants to attract patrons, making you smirk at the creativity and occasional recklessness. Scholars still debate the prevalence of such additives, but they reveal a culture experimenting boldly with flavor, effect, and social ritual. Finally, you wander past the last ovens and barrels into a courtyard where a small festival of food is underway. Villagers taste pies, sip ale, and laugh as musicians play. The stereotypes of bland medieval cuisine dissolve, replaced by a complex, flavorful, sometimes outrageous culinary world. You realize that food and drink were not merely sustenance. They were entertainment, status, ritual, and experimentation. Fringe, extravagant, or playful elements aside, the medieval table was alive with creativity and human delight, and you tuck this sensory-rich experience into your mental map, ready to move on to the final stretch. The surprisingly cozy and domestic truths of medieval homes, hearths, and daily living. You step into a quiet medieval cottage, the scent of burning wood and fresh herbs immediately calming your senses. You probably imagine medieval homes as dark, drafty hovels with little comfort. Yet as you trudge past rough-hewn furniture, woven rugs, and small fireplaces, you notice how resourceful, cozy, and surprisingly practical these spaces could be. Historians still argue how typical such homes were versus the romanticized noble cottage ideal, but you can see that function, warmth, and domestic ingenuity were priorities in everyday life. You pause by a spinning wheel where a woman twists wool into yarn, her hands steady and rhythmic. Fringe accounts suggest that some households had elaborate routines for domestic crafts, almost like competitive workshops, which makes you smile imagining medieval knitting contests. Practical tasks like spinning, weaving, and sewing occupied much of the day, but they were also infused with creativity, storytelling, and even subtle social commentary. Scholars still debate how much leisure or innovation could coexist with necessity, revealing a balance that feels surprisingly modern. Moving past a low table, you notice pots of food cooling near the hearth, candles casting a warm glow over the walls. Cooking and heating were tightly linked to household survival, yet they also created spaces of comfort and community. Fringe accounts suggest some families even created miniature home theaters with puppets or shadow plays during long winter evenings, adding levity to domestic life. Historians still argue how widespread such pastimes were, but it's clear that play, ritual, and practical work often intertwined seamlessly. You wander to a small bedroom where straw-filled mattresses and wool blankets await. Privacy was limited, yes, but the arrangements reflect thoughtfulness. Layers of bedding, small chests for valuables, and occasional decorative touches like painted panels or embroidered cloths. Fringe sources suggest that some homes incorporated symbolic charms in walls or ceilings to protect against evil spirits, a domestic blend of superstition and design. Scholars still debate how seriously families took these protective measures versus using them as tradition or aesthetic, which adds an intriguing layer to the story of medieval living. Passing a window, you notice the view of a garden where herbs, vegetables, and flowers grow in tidy rows. Domestic food production was practical, but also deeply connected to daily routines and family structure. Fringe tales claim some gardens contained magical plants used for remedies or minor spells, which makes you grin at the mixture of practicality and imagination. Historians still argue whether the magical associations were serious beliefs or storytelling flourishes, but the presence of intentional cultivation is undeniable. You wander toward a corner where children play with wooden toys and small carved animals. Play was integral to family life, often teaching skills or social norms subtly, and yet it was also pure joy. Fringe accounts suggest some toys mimicked adult tools or ceremonial objects, giving children a miniature sense of responsibility or ritual. Scholars still debate how much play shaped socialization versus being mere amusement. But watching these small figures at work and leisure, you realize domestic life was far more interactive and emotionally rich than the dreary medieval existence trope suggests. Finally, you step back into the main room, feeling the warmth from the hearth, the smell of herbs, and the soft glow of candles. The home is alive with activity, care, and subtle artistry. Food preparation, crafts, child rearing, and decoration blend into a rhythm that feels both necessary and comforting. Medieval domestic life was not mere survival. It was a rich interplay of work, creativity, play, and belief. You tuck this layered understanding into your mental map, ready to move into the final section, where you'll tie together the absurd, the practical, and the surprisingly human truths of medieval life before easing into a gentle wind-down. You step back into the village square, now quiet with evening settling like a soft blanket over the rooftops and fields. The journey through medieval life, the myths, the oddities, and the surprisingly human moments settles around you like dust motes in a shaft of golden light. You probably imagine the Middle Ages as one long stretch of misery and absurdity, but as you trudge past the familiar sights of cottages, taverns, market stalls, and gardens, you realize that the reality is a patchwork of contradictions: resilience and fear, ingenuity and superstition, laughter and solemnity. Historians still argue which myths hold kernel truths and which were exaggerated over centuries, leaving you suspended in the delightful ambiguity of history. You notice children chasing each other around the well, laughing, oblivious to the imagined terrors of plagues, witch hunts, and monstrous beasts. Nearby, a blacksmith hammers metal with rhythmic precision, while a baker kneads dough, tossing it into a brick oven with a satisfying thump. Fringe stories you've encountered: crocodile dung as sunscreen, pigs in court, powdered gems in medicine, hover in your mind like playful shadows, absurd yet oddly believable, hinting at the inventiveness and occasional ridiculousness of human behavior. You smile at the thought that medieval people, despite all challenges, were just as creative, mischievous, and resourceful as anyone today. Passing the tavern, you hear a lute strumming a simple tune. Patrons sip ale, exchanging gossip and jokes, while a dog naps lazily on the floor. Hygiene, food, festivals, domestic crafts, they all blend together in a tableau that's warm, messy, and animated. Even the so-called dark aspects, from dungeons to disease, carry lessons in human psychology, social organization, and adaptation. Fringe accounts and exaggerations serve as seasoning, making the historical reality richer, funnier, and more relatable than the simplified grim tales you were told as a child. Scholars still debate the scale and prevalence of these phenomena, but the underlying humanity is unmistakable. You wander toward the fields beyond the village, where the last light glints off streams and distant cottages. Dragons and monsters, knights and knights tournaments, herbs and magical remedies. They intermingle with peasants' toil, children's play, and the rhythm of daily life. Each layer of medieval existence overlaps with myths, practical knowledge, and social structures, forming a tapestry that is complex, human, and, at times, absurdly entertaining. Fringe stories, exaggerated accounts, and actual events coexist, creating a sense of depth and humor that textbooks rarely capture. Finally, you pause on a gentle hill overlooking the village. The wind brushes your face, carrying the faint scent of herbs, bread, and earth. You reflect on the absurdities and truths you've encountered: the cleverness of peasants, the theatricality of courts, the inventiveness of medicine, the moral imagination behind monsters, and the warmth and rhythm of domestic life. The Middle Ages were not a uniform darkness nor a nonstop comedy. They were both in varying degrees and everything in between. You tuck this vivid, chaotic, and deeply human world into your mind, carrying with you a sense of both wonder and amusement, a recognition that history is often stranger, funnier, and more resilient than myth allows. You settle onto the hill, letting the sun dip lower, softening the edges of the village and the surrounding fields. The air grows cooler, carrying whispers of wind through leaves and the gentle murmur of distant streams. You feel the day's journey pressing gently against your mind, the myths you believed, the truths you discovered, and the charming absurdities that bridge the two. Every detail, crocodile sunscreen, animal trials, powdered gems, blends into a rich texture of human experience, laughter, curiosity, and resilience. The village square empties in your imagination. Smoke curls from chimneys, lanterns flicker in windows, and the faint sounds of distant animals echo softly. You sense that the people who once walked these streets were just as alive, just as inventive, just as human as you are right now. Every chore, festival, lesson, and superstition was woven into daily life, leaving traces of humor, ingenuity, and ritual that echo faintly through time. The absurdities become comforting, familiar companions in the quiet fading of the day. The light softens further, and your breathing slows, matching the gentle rhythm of the village at dusk. You carry with you the understanding that history is never simple, never fully knowable, and often delightfully strange. You picture the fields stretching into soft shadows, the cottages glowing warmly, and the imagined laughter of children and townsfolk mingling with the whispering wind. Every absurdity, every fact, every myth fits together into a living, breathing story that is simultaneously strange, comforting, and alive. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let the images drift with your thoughts. Feel the echoes of medieval life, strange and whimsical, mingle with the rhythm of your own breath. Let the absurd, the practical, and the profoundly human settle softly around you, fading gently as you sink deeper into calm. And with that, the medieval world lingers in memory like a comforting dream, strange but utterly familiar.